Hello students, how are you? This is economics lesson video for grade 12, presented by me, Mr. Fitumermias. It is for term 1, week 3 and lesson 3. In today's lesson, we are going to discuss about industrial development strategy during the post-Derg period or during the EPRDF government of Ethiopia. Student, do you remember what I've discussed in the previous lesson? Good. We have tried to see the industrial development strategy during the Derg regime in Ethiopia. Let us briefly revise that. Related to the industrial development strategy during Derg, there was a radical change in the structure, ownership, and management. The government nationalized all medium and large scale enterprises which were owned by the private sector in the previous government. And the government also took various discouraging measures discouraging the private sector involvement in the area. Measures like setting or imposing capital ceiling, not allowing investors to have more than one line of a business. The tax structure were very harsh for the private sector. The interest rate for borrowers again were very high for private sector. Public enterprises and cooperatives were the one that favored by the government. This was the overall activity taken by the government after the fall of the imperial regime. All these measures and policies retarded the expansion of the manufacturing sector during the military government, particularly by paralyzing the private sector. But the government do some activities in order to support and expand small-scale industry enterprises by establishing the Handicraft and Small-Scale Industrial Development Agency or HASIDA. But these were not effective in achieving the required development and expansion due to lack of institutional capacity and lack of adequate support from the government. Then, after the collapse of socialism in the Western countries, the Derg regime tried to introduce some economic liberalization by introducing a mixed economic policy. However, those various encouraging measures were not effective because the civil conflict or the civil war was reaching its climax. The other part were the size, ownership, and regional distribution. In terms of size, the number of manufacturing establishments were declined or reduced because of the unfavorable government policy towards to the private activities, lack of foreign exchange, and the independence of Eritrea are the reasons for the decline in the number of manufacturing establishments during Derg. In relation to ownership, we know large and medium scale enterprises were owned by the government. The small scale and handicrafts were left to the private sector. In relation to the distribution of the manufacturing sector, it is mainly influenced by the development of infrastructure like the availability of electricity, road, communication, water supply, proximity to input and output market, social services. All these are reasons for the distribution of the manufacturing sector. Because of this, it is highly concentrated in the metropolitan areas. The availability and the development of all these factors are better in the metropolitan areas other than remote regions. This was what we tried to see in the previous session. I hope you will be able to recall some of the basic concepts. Industrial development strategy during the EPRDF government. During this period, the transitional government, particularly after the fall of the Derg, the transitional government of Ethiopia announced an economic policy which could be described as cautious capitalism. Previously, we know the ideology that was socialist ideology. The government is the one that controlled the overall economic activity. The industrial sector activities were being controlled by the government. The involvement of private sector were not allowed. Here, in the conscious capitalism, the government tried to encourage the involvement of private sector at large. With respect to the industrial sector, the transitional government of Ethiopia indicate that the role of the state would be limited to the areas of large-scale engineering, metallurgical plant, communication, power supply, and pharmaceutical industries. These are areas which is restricted to the government. The rest are free for the private sector to involve at large. There is no limit in other areas. This was the new strategy which is designed by the transitional government after the fall of the Derg. The government undertook a public enterprise reform program in 1992. This reform program were taken not only in the industrial sector. In all economic activity, there was a reform taken by the government in 1992, which aimed at enhancing efficiency, productivity, and competitiveness in public enterprises. This was done by dismantling the subsectoral corporations under the Ministry of Industry. A more relaxed measure, labor code, was proclaimed, particularly to encourage the private sector participation in the economy. We'll see these measures in the next slide. Here are the measures taken by the government to encourage the involvement of the private sector in the reform in 1992. The lifting of the restriction on private sector investment capital in the number of business ventures. If you remember from the previous lesson, students, the Derg regime were imposing capital ceiling on private investment. There was a maximum limit for investors, and investors were not allowed to have more than one business line. They were not allowed to open different branches in different areas. These restrictions were lifted during this reform in 1992. The easing of license requirements and regulations. License for investment in other business activities now become easy. Investment incentives were offered in the form of tax holiday, duty free import of investment goods, the downward revision of tax and tariffs from the extremely high level in that exists before the reform period. The marginal tax rate on personal income was slashed from 89% to 40%. Business profit tax were reduced from 59% to 35%, while the maximum tariff on imports was reduced to 50%, down from 240%. This is highly encouraging measures for the private sector involvement in various economic activities. And these are measures taken by the government in the reform in 1992. In addition to all those measures, the government introduced an overall development strategy, the agricultural development led industrialization strategy. I hope students you remind that from the previous lesson. It has four major programs. The development of agriculture is the base for the development of the industrial sector. Size, ownership, and regional distribution of the manufacturing sector. According to the Central Statistical Authority, there was an increase in the size of large and medium scale, small scale, in cottage or handicraft establishments during 2007 and 2008. The reason for the increase in the establishment of the manufacturing sector is the involvement of the private sector at large. Food and beverage establishment account for 52% of the total manufacturing enterprises, while textile account for about 22%. Why these two manufacturing enterprises are expanding this much than that of other manufacturing enterprises? This is due to the fact that they depend heavily on local inputs. Their inputs are not imported from outside the country. The inputs are available at large from the agricultural sector. This is one reason. And due to the availability of domestic market for their product, there is huge market domestically for those products. These are the reasons for the expansion of food and beverage and textile manufacturing enterprises than the rest of other manufacturing enterprises. Regarding to the ownership structure, the small scale and cottage or handicraft enterprises are totally owned and managed by the private sector. The ownership of large and medium scale manufacturing enterprises has shown changes in the past few decades. The share of the private sector increased. This is due to the active involvement of the private sector and the privatization program. Privatization program mean when the government privatize state-owned enterprises to the private sector, hand over the government-owned enterprises, large-scale enterprises to the private sector. Due to privatization and the high involvement of the private sector, increased the share of owning large and medium scale manufacturing enterprises and the withdrawal of the government from new investment in the areas of large and medium scale manufacturing. These are the reasons for the increase in the private sector owning large and medium scale manufacturing enterprises. Regarding to regional distribution of the manufacturing establishment, here in the EPRDF government, we see unbalanced distribution. Distribution depends on several factors. We have seen in the previous lessons too. Infrastructural development, road, electricity, communication, water supply, proximity to input and output, market. All these are factors which affect the distribution of the manufacturing establishment. Relatively, the availability of these factors are higher in the metropolitan areas than that of remote regions or other regional areas. The higher the availability of these factors, the higher will be the number of the manufacturing establishments. Particularly, proximity to input and output market is the most determinant element for manufacturing enterprises to establish in the metropolitan areas. Okay, students, that's all for today. To highlight what we try to see in today's lesson, we have dealt with the industrial development strategy of the EPRDF government. When the government change took place in 1991, the transitional government of Ethiopia announced an economic policy which could be described as cautious capitalism, which is a total change in the ideology from the previous government. This now allow the involvement of the private sector at large. Then the traditional government clearly state that the role of the government in the industrial development has to be limited in the area of large scale engineering, metallurgical plant, communication, power supply, and pharmaceutical industries. The rest are totally open for their private sector involvement at large. This was a drastical change after government change. And then the government also took a public enterprise reform program in 1992, which aiming to enhance efficiency, productivity, and competitiveness in public enterprises. And a more relaxed labor code was proclaimed that encouraged the involvement of private sector. The code includes the lifting of the restriction on private sector investment capital and the number of business ventures. Previously, there was capital ceiling, and private sectors were not allowed to open different branches. That was lifted by the transitional government. The easing of license requirement and regulation, investment incentives were offered by the government, like the tax holiday, duty-free import of investment goods, and there is also a downward revision of tax and tariffs. That was the best encouraging measures for the private sector. Above all these measures, the government introduced a new plan, the agricultural development led industrialization. In order to lead the development of industry, it should base the development of the agricultural sector. The development of agricultural sector will lead for further development of the industrial sector. This was the overall development strategy designed by the EPRDF government. Then, in relation to the size, ownership, and regional distribution, in terms of size, it is significantly increased in terms of large scale, medium scale, and small scale enterprises because of the involvement of the private sector. That is the basic reason for the increase in the establishment of the manufacturing during the EPRDF regime. In relation to ownership, the private sector now become owned even large and medium scale manufacturing enterprises. This is one of the other basic thing. Why the government also allow them to own those enterprises or manufacturers. Privatization program is the one that hand over government large and medium scale enterprises to the private sector. In relation to regional distribution, it's obvious the metropolitans have large manufacturing establishment because of the relatively adequate availability of factors that affect the establishment of the manufacturing enterprises. It's all about in today's lesson. I hope you will have some basic information. As usual, read and develop the knowledge by yourself from the textbook. Do the following exercise on your exercise book. Until we meet in the next lesson video, goodbye.